You're standing in the ruins of Constantinople. The year is 1453. Smoke twists into the gray morning sky, rising from the city that once called itself eternal. You can still hear the faint echo of cannon fire, now replaced by cries that aren't tea of battle, but of something far worse. For more than 1,000 years, these walls had protected the world's greatest city. But this time, the enemy didn't just want its gold, its churches, or its crown. They wanted something else, something that no historian, no poet, and no sermon could ever fully describe. When the Ottoman armies broke through the gates of Constantinople, they didn't simply destroy a city, they began a process that would echo through generations, a cold, systematic ritual that turned victory into psychological warfare. At first, it looked like chaos, soldiers rushing through narrow alleys, doors splintering open, smoke billowing from wooden roofs. But it wasn't chaos. It was order, planned, rehearsed, and written into the empire's military code. Every move, every act, every tear was part of a strategy designed to erase an entire people from memory, body, name, and soul. Among the survivors was a young woman named Eleni, a mother of one. She had lost her husband 3 days earlier when the final cannon breached the wall. He had died defending the gate of St. Romanus, while she had hidden in the cellar with her child, praying for mercy. When the door above her broke open, she realized mercy was not part of what was coming. The Ottomans called it population processing, a phrase so sterile it could have belonged in an accountant's ledger. Women, children, and the elderly were not seen as civilians. They were categorized, evaluated, and processed. In public squares, under the shadow of burning churches, families were brought forward, one by one. The men were separated and led away, never to be seen again. But what happened next was even more chilling. The women were lined up in silence, while Ottoman officers marked lists on parchment. They were not recording names, only numbers, ages, and estimated value. It was the birth of a terrifying bureaucracy where human life was reduced to inventory. Those of certain age or appearance were set aside, destined for the empire's inner circles. The rest vanished into records too vague, too sanitized to reveal their true fate. This was not the first time it happened, and it would not be the last. Across centuries of Ottoman expansion, the same system appeared over and over again. The calm after conquest, where soldiers put down their swords and picked up quills, turning living people into statistics. What made it so horrifying wasn't just the brutality, it was the orderliness of it. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was policy. By sunset, the city that once held 500,000 souls had become a living ledger. Women and children stood in lines that stretched through the squares, under banners bearing the crescent and the Sultan's seal. For every family broken, there was a number. For every cry, a line of ink. And in that silence between screams and smoke, the real conquest began, not of land, but of identity. Ottoman officials believed fear could rule more efficiently than steel. So, they made fear their signature. They turned the anguish of mothers into messages that traveled farther than armies ever could. Villages in distant lands would surrender before the Ottomans even arrived, terrified by what they had heard happened to the wives of defeated warriors. But what most people don't realize is that behind this machinery of conquest lay something deeply calculated, an economy built on human lives. Ships that carried spices and silk also carried people. Markets that traded gold also traded hope. And every ledger, every receipt, every list of numbers whispered the same truth. This was not random cruelty. It was organized, deliberate, and profitable. Eleni's story disappears from written history that day, but in a strange way, she represents millions of unnamed voices, women whose only crime was surviving the wrong battle, in the wrong century, under the wrong empire. What the Ottomans created wasn't just an empire, it was a psychological weapon that reshaped entire civilizations. It taught generations that surrender was mercy and resistance was madness. And yet, in the quiet corners of monasteries and village churches, whispers survived, stories passed down by those who escaped, speaking of the night the city fell and the rituals that followed. Some called it vengeance, others called it destiny, but the truth is far darker and far more organized than anyone dared to imagine. If you've made it this far, you probably sense there's more to this story than conquest. What happened next would reveal just how deep the Ottomans' machinery of domination went, and how the empire turned human despair into a system of control. Before we continue, if you believe history should not hide its darkest chapters, consider subscribing. It helps us bring forgotten truths like this one to light. And your support means we can keep telling the stories that textbooks left behind. Because the next part of this story doesn't just describe what the Ottomans did, it reveals why they did it and how they turned pain into power. And when you hear what came after the fall of Constantinople, you'll understand why some historians say the real conquest began after the fighting stopped. When the smoke cleared over Constantinople, the empire began what it called the Restoration. To the Ottomans, this meant rebuilding the city under new order and faith. To the survivors, it meant the slow erasure of everything they had ever known. In the months that followed, an eerie calm settled over the ruins. The great churches were converted, the banners were replaced, and life appeared to return. But beneath the marble streets, in the chambers of administration and power, something else was unfolding, a quiet, deliberate transformation of people into property. Records show that within days of the conquest, Ottoman scribes were already compiling detailed ledgers of those processed through the capital. Thousands of names had been replaced with numbers. Each number represented a life, a mother, a sister, a child, categorized by age, strength, and usefulness to the empire. It was a system that disguised cruelty behind efficiency. But for those trapped within it, the horror wasn't just in what happened, it was in how normal it all seemed. The soldiers no longer shouted, they took notes. The streets were no longer filled with chaos, they were filled with silence. And in that silence, identity itself began to fade. Across the empire, new facilities appeared, called conversion houses or formation centers. These were not dungeons of chains and torture, but institutions of quiet control. They were designed to change people from within. Here, captives were stripped of names, language, and belief until nothing remained of who they once were. Historians describe these places as schools, but they were closer to laboratories of loyalty, where faith, fear, and survival blended into something unrecognizable. Those who complied were rewarded with food, protection, and false comfort. Those who resisted simply disappeared. Inside one such center in Bursa, a young woman, perhaps Eleni, perhaps someone like her, would wake each morning to the sound of the call to prayer. She no longer remembered the hymns of her childhood. Her name had been changed to something foreign, her language corrected, her memories called sins. The empire didn't just claim her body, it rewrote her soul. And that was the genius of it. The Ottomans didn't merely conquer cities, they conquered continuity. Every new generation, born from these processed women, carried within them the Empire ES design, bloodlines rewritten by power, culture replaced by obedience. This was how the empire endured, not only through armies or fortresses, but through a system that reshaped humanity itself. The story of Eleni and the countless others like her was not just one of survival, but of transformation against their will. What made it so haunting was how perfectly it worked. Villages stopped resisting, not because they were weak, but because they had seen what happened to those who fought back. Entire communities began to change their customs, teaching daughters to hide, to run, to vanish at the first sound of hoofbeats. Parents taught their children that silence was safety. Generations learned that forgetting was the only form of freedom left. And yet, even in the deepest corners of the empire, fragments of the old world survived. A lullaby sung in a forbidden language, a secret symbol carved behind a wall, the small acts of remembrance that defied the machinery of empire. Centuries later, historians would uncover these stories not from royal archives, but from letters smuggled across monasteries, from songs whispered into distant mountain villages. They spoke of women who remembered the faces of their captors, but also the names of their ancestors. They carried two histories inside them, one written by the empire and one that refused to die. When we talk about conquest, we often speak of battles, sieges, victories, and treaties. But the real conquest happens after the fighting stops. It happens when fear becomes a language, when silence becomes law, and when people begin to forget who they once were. The Ottomans mastered that art. Their strength wasn't only in their swords or cannons, it was in their ability to make entire civilizations reshape themselves in the image of obedience. For the wives of defeated warriors, death might have been an end, but what they endured was a lifetime of erasure, one heartbeat at a time. Every day they woke up under new names, new prayers, and new rules, until one day, even their memories bowed to the empire. And yet, the greatest irony is this. For all their efforts to control history, the Ottomans couldn't stop the truth from surviving. The ledgers they kept, those cold records of lives reduced to ink, became their own confession centuries later. Every number was a witness, every mark on parchment, a silent testimony that refuses to fade. The empire that once sought to erase others now lives on through the stories of those it tried to destroy. Their suffering became the evidence that outlived their conquerors. If you've made it to the end, ask yourself this. How many times in history has silence been mistaken for peace? How many empires have called cruelty order and conquest civilization? Because the story of Constantinople is not just about what the Ottomans did, it is about what humanity is capable of when power meets purpose and mercy disappears. The city fell in 3 days, but its shadow lasted 6 centuries. And maybe, just maybe, the real tragedy isn't a tea that they destroyed a world. It is that they made people forget it ever existed.